The foundational ledger burned at 1847 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, there would be nothing left but ash and the ghost of $4 million, and the men who had died for it would still be dead. But that was if everything went according to Eleanor Sterling's carefully constructed plan. It wasn't. 13 hours earlier, Elias Sterling stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror in his private dressing room, straightening his black silk bow tie. The chandelier above him threw warm light across the mahogany paneling, and in the glass, his reflection stared back, pale, rigid, a man constructed rather than born. His fingers were steady, but something beneath the surface was trembling. He had practiced this moment 1,000 times. The formal tilt of the chin, the angle of the shoulders, the precise curve of the smile that meant absolutely nothing. Tonight, he was to receive the Sterling Foundation's Centennial Award. 100 years of philanthropy, 100 years of lies. Though only he would know that in precisely 40 minutes. The distant sound of Mozart filtered up through the air vents, the string quartet tuning below in the Grand Ballroom. He picked up the heavy silver fountain pen from his vanity and signed a document titled Sterling Foundation Endowment Expansion. The nib scratched against the thick parchment with a decisive, almost aggressive stroke. Elias Sterling III. The signature meant nothing now. It would mean even less by morning. His personal phone vibrated on the marble vanity top, the screen lit with a message from an unknown number. The foundations are built on bones. Look at the 1924 ledger, Elias. He gripped the edge of the marble table, his knuckles turning white. On the wall hung a framed oil portrait of his grandfather, Elias III, holding a golden spade in one hand and smiling with the serene confidence of a man certain of his righteousness. The grandfather's eyes seemed to track him in the mirror, following his every movement. Elias's chest heaved slightly. He opened his desk drawer with deliberate slowness and reached inside, past the usual contents, cufflinks, old letters, a leather-bound journal, to a hidden compartment that clicked open at his touch. From it, he withdrew a small key with a brass tag labeled Archive Vault. The metal was cold against his palm. He slid it into his tuxedo pocket. The muffled applause from the floor below seemed to be calling him. The moment was approaching. But first, he had to know the truth. Or rather, he had to confirm what he had already begun to suspect. He checked his appearance one final time. Then he turned toward the door. The north hall was dimly lit, its walls lined with silk wallpaper the color of old blood. Elias moved quickly down the corridor, his patent leather shoes silent against the Persian rug. He was halfway to the service stairs when a figure stepped out from behind a velvet curtain. It was Julian. His younger brother was disheveled in a way that only Julian could be. His tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his bow tie torn and hanging around his neck like a defeated banner. He held a half-empty glass of amber liquid, and his eyes had that particular glassiness that came from hours of deliberate drinking. Julian smiled when he saw Elias, a smile without warmth. "Going somewhere, brother? The cameras are waiting for the golden boy." His words were slurred, each one pronounced with exaggerated care. Elias tried to move past him, but Julian's hand shot out, gripping his shoulder and driving him backward. His back hit the wainscoting with a solid thud, and the impact sent a small painting swinging on its wire. "Get your hands off me, you drunk. Not tonight." Elias's voice was low, controlled, but beneath it ran a current of something darker. Julian's grip tightened. And then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, he threw the contents of his glass directly into Elias's face. The whiskey was cheap and burned as it ran into his eyes. He squeezed them shut, gasping, and in that moment of blindness, Elias felt something shift inside him, something primal and ancient. He drove his fist forward, aiming for where he calculated Julian's body would be. His knuckles connected with something soft, and Julian made a sound like the wind being expelled from a bellows. Elias's vision cleared enough to see his brother doubled over. And then Elias was grabbing his hair, pulling him downward and slamming his head against a side table that held a porcelain vase. The vase didn't break elegantly. It shattered with a sound like something precious dying, white and blue pieces scattering across the floor like scattered teeth. Julian groaned, his body going limp. Elias stepped back, breathing heavily. He pulled a white silk handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face, careful to avoid his eyes. A small streak of blood appeared on the white silk, not his own. He looked down at his brother, crumpled on the floor, at the broken porcelain, at the scattered diamonds of glass, and felt nothing at all. Then he turned and continued down the hallway toward the service entrance. The underground archive was exactly as he remembered it. A fluorescent-lit room of metal filing cabinets, stretching floor to ceiling, the air thick with the smell of old paper and ozone. A dehumidifier hummed in the corner, its green light steady and constant. He used the brass key to unlock the heavy steel door, and it swung inward with the groan of something that had been sealed for a very long time. The moment he crossed the threshold, a red light blinked on the security camera mounted in the corner. He didn't move. Elias picked it up with fingers that no longer felt like his own. The paper was yellowed, the typewritten text faded, but still legible. Charges set. Inspection bypassed. 212 laborers accounted for inside. Proceed. The signature at the bottom was his grandfather's. ESI Elias stared at the words until they blurred, then snapped back into focus. 212 men. He tried to imagine that number, tried to hold it in his mind. 212 distinct lives, each one with a name, a face, a family. 212 men who had walked into a mine and never walked out again. Above him, the security camera made a soft, clicking sound. The red light was steady, recording, documenting his discovery, just as it had documented everything else. And then, in that moment of absolute clarity, Elias understood that someone knew he was coming. Someone had known all along. The vault door slammed shut with a sound like thunder in a confined space. The noise echoed off the metal cabinets, reverberating through his chest. Elias spun around to see a man entering through a service hatch. A man he recognized as Miller, one of Eleanor's private security detail. Miller held a retractable baton that expanded with a sharp metallic click. His face was blank, professional, the expression of someone for whom violence was simply a part of the job description. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at Elias with the cold assessment of a mechanic examining a broken engine. "Mr. Sterling, you shouldn't have come down here. Give me the book." The words were delivered without inflection, as if he were reading from a script that had already been decided. Elias clutched the ledger tighter. "My mother sent you." Miller swung the baton upward in a sharp arc. Elias ducked, feeling the air part above his head with a whistle. He stepped forward and drove the corner of the heavy ledger into the space where Miller's throat met his shoulder. The impact sent Miller staggering backward, gasping, his free hand going to his neck. But Miller was trained for this. He recovered quickly, spinning his body and delivering a solid kick to Elias's knee. Pain exploded up Elias's leg, white and sharp. He fell, his body hitting the concrete hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Above him, Miller raised the baton for a downward strike. Elias rolled, and the baton came down where his head had been, hitting the concrete with a metallic clang. He scrambled backward, under a heavy oak desk. and watched Miller's boots approach. Without thinking, acting on pure survival instinct, Elias reached up and grabbed a brass paperweight from the desk, hurling it downward with all his remaining strength. It connected with Miller's shin, and Miller made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a curse. The distraction was enough. Elias surged forward and brought the ledger up with both hands, connecting solidly with Miller's temple. Miller dropped like something cut from a string, his body falling heavily to the concrete floor. Blood trickled from his temple, dark and slow. Elias stood over him, breathing hard, and took the key card from Miller's belt. He ran to the emergency exit and swiped it with shaking fingers. The light flashed red. Access denied. Administrative lock. He pounded on the door, his mind racing. Above him, the security camera was still recording. He hammered on the steel door, his fists making hollow thuds against the metal. His hands were covered in dust and a bit of Miller's blood, and he could feel his pulse beating in his temples, a tribal drum counting down to something he couldn't yet see. Then the intercom crackled to life. The voice that came through was cool, aristocratic, and absolutely devoid of warmth. It was the voice of someone making a decision that had already been made. It was his mother. Elias, stop acting like a child. Put the ledger in the incinerator chute. Now. He held the ledger up to the security camera. He murdered them, Mother. 200 people. For insurance money. The foundation is a lie. The pause that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. He could hear the faint sound of the gala's orchestra filtering down through the ventilation system. A distant waltz meant to celebrate his family's legacy of charity and good works. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was sharper, edged with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. It was hard to tell the difference in her. The foundation is the only reason your name means anything. If that book leaves the vault, we have zero. I have already called the cleaners. You have 5 minutes. The line went dead. Elias looked around the archive room with new eyes. His gaze found the ventilation grate near the ceiling, and without allowing himself to think about what came next, he dragged Miller's body across to the desk and climbed up. His fingers found the grate's fasteners. Simple screws, nothing elaborate. Using the brass paperweight, he unscrewed them one by one, each screw falling and clattering on the metal desk below. His palms were slick with sweat, but the work was methodical, precise. He had always been good at precision. The grate came free. The duct beyond was dark and narrow, lined with dust and cobwebs that had accumulated over decades. It smelled of stale air and the faint chemical tang of the building's HVAC system. He heard the vault door opening. 2 figures in tactical black gear and gas masks entered. One carried a suppressed pistol, the other a canister of liquid. They moved with the silent efficiency of people who had done this before, many times, in many places. Elias pulled himself into the duct, just as a bullet sparked off the metal grate edge, sending up a shower of sparks. The sound of his own grunt echoed in the confined space as he scrambled forward. The ledger clutched against his chest. Behind him, the dust of his passage hung in the air, and he could hear the cleaners speaking to each other in low, professional tones. Target is in the ducts, heading toward the kitchen exhaust. He crawled through the darkness, the heavy ledger pressing against his ribs like a second heart. The sound of the kitchen's industrial fans grew louder as he moved forward, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to penetrate his bones. The cobweb stuck to his face, and he coughed quietly, trying to suppress the sound. Somewhere behind him, he could hear the thermal scanner beeping as it tracked his heat signature through the metal walls. Elias kicked out the ceiling panel and dropped into the industrial kitchen. He landed on a stainless steel prep table and immediately slipped on a layer of grease, crashing hard to the floor. Pain shot through his hip and ribs, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then he heard slow, deliberate applause. Julian was standing by the walk-in freezer door, his head wrapped in a pristine white bandage. He held a heavy chef's knife, and unlike the whiskey-soaked version Elias had left bleeding on the hallway floor, this Julian looked sharp and sober. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had made a decision and found clarity in it. "Mother's right, Elias. You don't have the stomach for this legacy." The words came out smooth and unhurried, each one carefully placed. Julian lunged forward, the knife descending in a smooth arc toward Elias's throat. Elias grabbed a metal tray and brought it up to intercept. The knife struck the aluminum with a terrible screech of metal on metal, leaving scratches that caught the fluorescent light. Elias drove his foot upward in a desperate kick, catching Julian's leg and sweeping it out from under him. Julian fell hard, the knife clattering across the floor. Elias rose and brought the heavy ledger down in a vicious overhead strike aimed at Julian's face. The brass corner of the book connected with Julian's nose, and something in that connection made a sound like a green branch breaking. Julian's scream was wet and bubbly. Blood poured down his face, an arterial crimson that seemed impossibly bright under the kitchen lights. Elias stood over him, breathing hard, and picked up the knife. He held the blade to his brother's throat, watching the arterial pulse beneath the skin. Julian was laughing. Despite the blood, despite the obvious agony, he was laughing. "Do it," Julian gasped between laughs. "Check the 1925 records. Look for your own name. The adoption papers." The library was dark and smelled of old leather and time. Elias limped between the shelves, holding his side where something felt fractured or cracked. He made his way to the 1925 section and pulled back the law books, his fingers finding a hidden file tucked deep into the space where the spines ended and shadow began. The file was manila, yellowed with age. Inside, held by a single fragile paperclip, was a birth certificate. Name: Baby Boy Miller. Father: Thomas Miller. Deceased: Blackwood Mine. Mother: Sarah Miller. Deceased. Date of birth: March 15th, 1925. Over the original name, stamped in red ink, was the Sterling family crest. The floor seemed to shift beneath Elias's feet. He sat down hard on the Persian rug, the birth certificate trembling in his hands. Miller. His real name was Miller. He was the child of the mine. He was the grandson of the men his grandfather had murdered. There was a memo clipped to the back of the certificate, typed on expensive stationery in his grandfather's name. The child will be raised as a Sterling, a living penance. He must never know he is the blood of the men we buried. A living penance. That was all he had ever been. That was the entire architecture of his existence. Built on top of bones, maintained by lies, perpetuated by the careful construction of a false identity that could never quite hold the weight of the truth beneath it. The clock on the mantel struck 9:45. The library doors locked with a heavy click. Elias looked up, startled, as mechanical shutters began sliding down over the windows. The light was cut off in a series of steady, deliberate movements until the room was completely dark. Not the darkness of night, but the absolute darkness of a sealed tomb. Then the hidden speaker activated. Eleanor's voice filled the space, smaller and more intimate than before, almost tender. "You were a charity project, Elias, and today the project is officially canceled." The concrete stairwell echoed with footsteps. The two cleaners dragged Elias down into the depths of the house, his hands zip-tied behind his back. The ledger was tucked under one cleaner's arm, like they were simply carrying papers from one office to another. The stairwell smelled of mold and something chemical, something that made Elias's eyes water even more than the zip ties cutting into his wrists. They emerged into the boiler room. The furnace was enormous, a piece of Victorian industrial art rendered entirely in iron and fire. Orange light pulsed through the grate like the breathing of something alive, and the heat rolled off the furnace in waves that made the air shimmer. The sound was a constant roar, the sound of fuel and flame achieving perfect combustion. Cleaner One approached the furnace door, and Elias watched as he prepared to open it. The heat would intensify the moment that door came open, a blast of temperature that would make even seasoned workers step back. But this man didn't flinch. He was simply doing his job. Cleaner Two forced Elias to his knees in front of the roaring flame. He pulled a syringe from his vest pocket, a clear liquid inside, something that would stop the heart without leaving much trace, something that people simply called the exit. The needle caught the firelight as he held it up to inspect it. Elias's eyes darted around the room. There, on the far wall, was a valve labeled Emergency Steam Vent in red paint. His hands were zip-tied, yes, but they were tied in front of him. If he could just move backward, if he could just position his fingers correctly. He lunged backward with every ounce of strength remaining in his body. His bound hands caught the red valve wheel, and he wrenched it clockwise with all the force his arms could generate. The sound was deafening. A massive jet of scalding steam erupted from the pipe system, a roaring white cloud that filled the boiler room in an instant. The heat was intense and immediate, and the cleaners screamed as the steam contacted their skin. Cleaner One dropped the ledger, and it fell onto the very edge of the furnace hearth, the cover immediately beginning to smoke. Elias twisted around and drove his forehead upward, connecting with Cleaner Two's masked face. The plastic cracked under the impact. Elias rolled toward the furnace, moving faster than he'd ever moved in his life, and grabbed the smoking ledger with his teeth. He could feel heat from the furnace beginning to singe the edges of his sleeve, could smell his own fabric beginning to char. He ran toward the coal chute, the ledger clutched in his bound hands behind him, and dove feet first into the dark tunnel. The metal chute was rough against his skin, and he could hear the screams of the cleaners receding above him as he slid down, down, into the cold darkness. He emerged on a pile of coal outside the estate, and the rain that had been threatening all evening finally came down in heavy sheets. The cold hit his scorched skin like a blessing. He lay for a moment on the coal, gasping for breath. And then he found a sharp piece of slate among the rocks. He sawed at his zip ties, desperate and methodical, until the plastic finally snapped. His wrists were bleeding where the ties had cut in, and his hands were numb from lack of circulation. But they were free. He stood up on the coal pile and looked back at the Sterling estate. The windows still glowed with golden light from the gala. The orchestra was still playing. The guests were still celebrating a legacy that had just been built on bones and flame and murder. Elias held the ledger close to his chest and began walking toward the light. The grand doors of the ballroom swung open. Elias walked down the center aisle of the gala, and the room fell into silence with the sudden completeness of a held breath. He was covered in coal dust, his expensive tuxedo torn and stained with blood and grease. His hair was matted, his face streaked with soot and ash. Behind him, he left footprints of coal and rainwater on the marble floor. The guests recoiled, their faces registering shock and something that might have been fear. The orchestra's music stopped abruptly, the violin's bows freezing mid-stroke. Eleanor stood at the podium, and the moment she saw Elias, something in her face collapsed. Her wine glass fell from her hand, and the crystals shattered against the stage with a sound like breaking bones. The red wine pooled at her feet like blood. Elias climbed the stage stairs, and Eleanor tried to move toward him, perhaps to grab him, perhaps to stop him. He shoved her aside, and she stumbled backward, falling into the arms of a guest. He opened the charred ledger directly on the podium, positioning it in front of the 5 microphones. He pointed his finger at the 1924 entry, at the numbers and the names and the evidence of his grandfather's careful documentation of his own crime. His voice was amplified throughout the estate and through the live broadcast cameras. It was steady and clear and absolutely without emotion. This foundation wasn't built on philanthropy. It was built on the murder of 212 men for $4 million. My grandfather ordered the blast. He began to read the names, each one enunciated clearly, each one carried out across the city and across the internet to millions of people who would never forget. Thomas Miller, James Thorne, Robert Chen, Samuel Dixon. Eleanor tried to grab the book, to reach for him, to do something to stop the words. Elias caught her wrist and held it firmly, looking directly into the main camera lens. His coal-stained hand gripped her clean, jeweled wrist, and in that moment, the entire architecture of his false life came down like a house built on sand. The iron gates of the Sterling estate clanged shut behind him. Police sirens flashed in the distance, their red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Elias carried nothing but his original birth certificate and the 1924 ledger. A small group of people waited outside the gates in the rain. An old woman with weathered hands and a simple gray coat stepped forward. Her face was lined with years of grief, but her eyes were clear and sharp. She held a small, faded photograph. It showed a man standing by a mine entrance, his face broad and weathered, his hands strong and calloused. The resemblance was perfect, unmistakable. "We've been waiting for you to find us, Thomas," the old woman said. Her voice was soft and trembling. Elias took the photograph and looked at his true father's face, a face he had never seen alive, but somehow recognized the moment he saw it. All of the Sterling in him seemed to drain away, leaving something younger and stranger and infinitely more real beneath. He unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket, the jacket of Elias Sterling III, of the man who had never truly existed, and dropped it into a roadside puddle. The black silk sank slowly into the oil and water, the Sterling crest disappearing beneath the surface. He walked toward the group, his footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. The old woman reached out and took his hand, and Elias, or Thomas, or whoever he was now, felt something in his chest that might have been recognition or might have been the first real breath he had taken in his entire life. The screen faded to black. In the distance, the lights of the Sterling Manor flickered once and went out.